From WBAZ Radio, it's Interview with the Artist with Walker Vreeland.
Well, today I'm very happy to welcome Grammy-nominated jazz pianist, vocalist, and radio show host Judy Carmichael. She's one of the world's leading interpreters of stride piano and swing, and you can hear her stride and swing and sing this weekend. This Sunday, September 14th, Judy Carmichael will be bringing her show, I Love Being Here With You, also the name of her latest record, to the American Hotel in Sag Harbor, and we are so pleased it has brought her here today. Judy, welcome.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for asking.
When did you start playing piano?
You know, I don't remember the exact moment, but I think I was probably 3 or 4. I can remember seeing my mom play piano and standing and looking at the side of the keys and her hands dipping into them and me wanting to do that. So I think I was fooling around about 3 or 4.
You grew up where?
In California, Southern California, about 20 minutes south of Los Angeles.
And do you remember the moment you were turned on to jazz?
I do remember the moment. Most people don't have a real moment. I mean, some artists have a real artistic epiphany, and I was one of those. I was already working playing piano. I played ragtime, and it's while I was in college, so I wasn't a music major, wasn't thinking I'd have a career in music, and this was just sort of a summer job. And one of the people who came to hear me, God bless him, I was so lucky, gave me a tape of Count Basie. And he just had an instinct. He said, I really think you're going to like this. And it was early Count Basie when he was with the Benny Moten Band, and it changed everything for me. I wasn't that enthusiastic about the piano before. I certainly wasn't a jazz fan per se. And I heard that and I thought, I want to learn how to do that. And I taught myself from the record.
You taught yourself. So, okay, unpack that for us, if you would. Because I'm just so fascinated by that you taught yourself. So how?
It is. It's something that impresses me more now, looking back at it, that it's one of those great things when you're young and enthusiastic and you don't know any limitations. You just dive into it. It's great that we have that we're motivated. Because I heard this and I didn't even know theory. I didn't know what key I was in. Piano is funny that way because you can take piano lessons and not know what key you're in. That sounds odd. Other instruments you have to know. But if you just read the notes, then you don't necessarily have to know the theory underpinning it, which I didn't. I was just learning by rote. So this was very hard to teach myself because when I was listening to this record, I didn't have the technology of today. I wasn't slowing it down. I was hearing it very fast. I wasn't hearing a G chord and knowing the notes in a G chord. I had to think, oh, that sounds like that.
Right. So obviously you had an ear.
I had a great ear. And I don't have perfect pitch, but I have great relative pitch. And I just bit by bit figured it out and in my head listened over and over and was able to do that. And then the more I played, the more I saw patterns. I saw that there were patterns in the music. And then when people would come by and hear me play, if they were a musician, I'd say, what key am I in? And I started figuring it out. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy story. I don't know anybody who learned that particular way. It's kind of unusual.
Well, you are a very unique figure in the jazz world. You're known for, and you specialize in, a rare form of pre-1950s jazz called stride. You want to explain what stride is?
Well, stride's the way that everybody played jazz piano in the early years, and people know it, even though they might not know that term, because it came out of ragtime, that same kind of bouncing left hand, and stride is, speaking of the left hand, is striding, S-T-R-I-D-E, like taking big steps. So the the left hand is hitting low bass notes and striding to the mid-range of the piano. So it's striding back and forth. There's this bouncing feel. It really swings. It's rhythmically driving, and it's a very pianistically dense style. It's a whole orchestra. But probably the people that people would know would be Fats Waller, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and they were big influences on me. But Fred Astaire also played stride piano. Anybody who grew up in that time, 20s and 30s, and played piano, played in some sort of stride style. So it's a vocabulary I use but don't imitate exactly. So I'm out of more of that swing feel.
Well, not only was Count Basie your initial introduction and inspiration to stride, but it was he who encouraged you to learn, right?
Well, it's a remarkable, again, you get older and you start seeing how remarkable these things are. I think when you're younger, you don't appreciate it to that degree, which I do now as you see how life and the patterns in life. He was my initial inspiration. That record made me want to be a pianist, a jazz pianist. And then just a few years later, if I'd have to think about it, maybe 4 years later, I met Count Basie because one of his musicians heard me, told Basie, you have to hear this girl playing stride piano. Basie was very excited about my playing and encouraged me. And indeed, right before he died, told me he was passing on the torch to me and nicknamed me Stride. That's what he called me. Whenever I saw him, he just said, hey, Stride.
He was a mentor of sorts.
He was a mentor. It was not a mentor in the way that I think we think of a mentor nowadays, which I think is a really great lesson. You and I, before we got on mic, were talking about the book Lean In. And I think that people have sometimes a very narrow view of what a mentor is. He didn't talk to me every day, but I always went to a lot of trouble and drove great distances or flew to hear Basie whenever he was anywhere near me, that I could hear him. So I would get to hear him then, and then he was always very encouraging. Who he was as a person, mentored me. So there were you can get mentoring in other ways, but certainly the fact that he told me that it rested on my shoulders to carry this on was a huge bit of inspiration for me.
Absolutely. Now, it was also through Disney, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was also through Disney that you met Sarah Vaughn.
Yes, yeah.
Because I was also
working, yeah.
a mentor. So this job at Disney... It really changed your life.
Well, it did. I resisted it. Disneyland, we're talking about Disneyland in California. They had been after me for years to work for them, playing piano, because they wanted a very specific kind of piano playing. They wanted ragtime and what I think of as honky-tonk, which is a kind of commercial version of ragtime in the good old summertime, all those turn-of-the-century tunes. And I could do it. And so finally I said yes and looked at it as a great way to get paid to practice because I would play 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. So it was a lot of piano playing. But the great benefit that you're referring to is that in the summer, and we're talking about the 80s because these people lived a bit longer than a lot of people think, they would have the Basie Band for a week. They'd have Buddy Rich for a week. They had all these people, so I'd play my sets, and then I'd be able to run over and hear Basie 5 nights in a row. Well, what was also happening is on the breaks, the Basie guys were wandering through the park and hearing people. So they'd go back and they'd say, you've got to hear this kid who's playing stride piano up the street. Sarah I met because she came out to Disneyland to hear Basie. So Basie introduced me to Sarah, and then she became a huge support. She was also a great pianist that a lot of people don't know, certainly not stride, but she was very encouraging.
How did she influence you as a musician?
Oh, my word. It's funny. Nobody ever asks me about that Sarah connection, which is great that you do that. There are so many ways because I got to spend a lot of time with her. She asked me to go on vacation with her once. We went to Hawaii, so I had just a couple weeks of just hanging out and just sitting around listening to music. I think that the smartest thing I did, thank goodness, was I just knew to be quiet. So with all these older musicians that I got to know, I spoke when spoken to. I wasn't like a lot of times when you're young, you're pontificating about everything because you think you know. I knew nothing.
But you were smart enough to just be a sponge.
Exactly. Because I remember the one of the things that I said, which is a great illustration of the things I got with Sarah, is we're in this house that she'd rented in Hawaii, and she brought some of her band members and me. And we're sitting, and she said, put on something. She said, and she handed me a record. I didn't even look at it. I put it on. And it was a very hokey, to my ear, commercial version of Baby It's Cold Outside, man and woman singing it.
Neighbors might
But baby, it's bad out there.
say, what's
No
in this
cabs
drink?
to be had out there.
And I said, well, that's some really no happening, music. And she said, really? She goes, listen. And I was thinking I was real hip that I'd heard it. Well, she made me keep listening, and guess who it was? And eventually, with many listenings, I realized it was Sammy Davis Jr. and Carmen McRae. And she said, then Sarah said, I had to do a lot of those too. So they were trying to sound very square, very white, but she was she taught me about culture with that. She taught me about the record business with that, and she improved my ears. Because she didn't tell me who it was. She made me listen until I guessed the right thing. So there were things like that I got from Sarah. And just watching her, I'd come back to New York. I still lived in L.A. I'd come back to New York when she'd be here, and I'd go every night for 2 weeks. So I'd see the change and how she handled the audience, how one time she got sick. She probably lost an octave and only had 5 octaves left or whatever it was, and I'd see how she continued to improvise around her cold. So they were just amazing things.
Just one of those things, if we thought a bit.
You're listening to Walker Vreeland. Follow Walker on Twitter @WalkerOnRadio.
I'm here with jazz piano virtuoso and vocalist Judy Carmichael, and she will be performing this Sunday, September 14th, at the American Hotel in Sag Harbor. And for tickets, you can go to her website, judycarmichael.com. What was it about Stride that appealed to you? Was it just the sound of it, or was it also the performance component, meaning the physicality of stride piano and watching the hands leap these great distances across the keyboard?
That's such a great question. Since I first heard it on record, I didn't think about the physicality of it. It was just the joy. It was a Count Basie record, a recording called Prince of Wales. And it had a big band. It had the Benny Moten Band. And then there would be these sections where the band would drop out and it would just be piano. So to me, the fact that this is a piano form that can keep the rhythm going and keep the harmonic complexity going, even when the big band drops out, that's a special form of piano. Now, it was a special pianist as well. But that's what it was. It was the driving rhythm and the joy. It's the most joyful kind of music.
Well, I've heard the story of you being mistaken for a jazz musician of a different race and gender, but for those who have not, will you tell the story?
Well, it's happened a lot. I don't even know which one you're referencing, but I've had, in the early years, before most people at this point, if they're familiar with jazz or familiar with me, they know that I'm a white woman with blonde hair, 5'6", 115 pounds, and so they have an image of kind of my sort of surfer girl look.
Right.
Carmen McRae, the great singer Carmen McRae, was known for being very tough. People were really afraid of Carmen. And this was my first big jazz festival. It was at this wonderful Frank Gehry building in Concord, California. And she heard my sound check. And so she heard stride piano. So she sent somebody up to find the stride pianist. So she thought I was a guy and black. Mm-hmm. And so then I came down into her dressing room, and because they said, Carmen wants to see you. And I said, well, you asked to see me. And she said, no, I didn't. And I said, well, you wanted to see the stride pianist. And she gave me a once-over. I'll never forget it because she did. She really, her eyes went all over me. She goes, well, honey, you don't look like you play.
Wow.
And then she became this big, big supporter. I mean, she would